Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk to you about how I make custom signs. This is an example of one of the signs that I've made. So once I get a request for a custom sign, I talk it over with the customer and pick out a piece of wood that I think will fit whatever they're thinking about. So this was obviously very rough, cut with a chainsaw piece of wood. It was pine, and it had some interesting features in it, like that crack on the left side there and all the chainsaw marks. Well, I kind of did a rough drawing for them and told them what I was going to do. And after they had gone and they approved the original sign that I showed you in the paper, I went to work. What I do next is grind off with, I think this was 40 grit paper, sandpaper on this angle grinder. So this sandpaper was ready to be trashed, and it wasn't really doing the job. Even if it were a brand new one, it just wouldn't have done the job because those score marks from the chainsaw were pretty deep. And I just decided to use this carbide bit here, and I put that on and made short work of those chainsaw marks. So once I was done with the carbide bit, I went back to the 80 grit sandpaper and smoothed out the marks that the carbide cutter left. Each tool, depending on the aggressiveness of it, like a chainsaw, leaves some pretty severe marks. So I did not have my bandsaw at the time when I had this piece of wood, so it definitely got chainsaw marks in it. But I knew I could sand it out at a later date, which I'm doing here. Now I've switched, as you can see, to the 80 grit, and that is taking off a lot of those sand marks from the carbide tip. Now, this tool leaves its own marks, so it's just a process of continually going back to remove marks from the previous grit sandpaper or tool, whatever you're using. Now I'm going down. Actually, I'm using 80 grit here on my palm sander, which seems to do a totally different job from the angle grinder. I don't dig in as much with the palm sander. It's softer edges and it's just flatter. So this is the process that I go from one tool to another to find the best suitable tool and sandpaper to use. So this is, again, 80 grit. But it's just not as aggressive as the angle grinder 80 grit. So I use this, and then I go to 220, and then I finish it and start the carving process. So the next stage, now that it's nice and smooth, is get rid of sawdust and get my pencil out and transfer the original sketch that they signed off on. Everything was spelled right. That's critical, especially if you don't spell well. It's important that they sign off on a design that you have already created and that they've seen, like this piece of paper right here. So that's now what I'm going to transfer onto this particular piece of wood. I look for the center and try to balance it out so it's not heavy on one side or the other. As much as I'm not a fan of symmetrical things, I still think this sign needed to have some symmetry to it, and so that's why I went with the center, finding the center. Now, what they wanted this sign to say was cozy corner, and I guess I make a visual assessment of how it's going to look best in terms of balance, and then I draw it on in pencil so I can get rid of it, and then I thicken the lines. After I like the way it looks, I thicken the lines so I have a better idea when it gets carved out what it's going to look like. So I spent some time making this, I think, aesthetically pleasing, making sure that everything is lined up and the bottom of the line of the previous word is parallel with, all the lines are parallel basically. And this had 4 lines on it, and obviously I don't want a letter drop lower than the letter next to it, so that all was taken into consideration. I wanted it to be aesthetically pleasing for the customer. And once I'm happy with the pencil marks, I draw over it again with this marker. And the reason I do that is because with all that sawdust flying around that I use when I'm cutting the sign out, I can't see those pencil lines too well. So this, using the marker, that eliminates the problem of being able to see it. Now, my intention was to carve some of this out with this Dremel tool. So I start to try that and do that. There's a carbide bit there. I've got tons of different bits that I used. But this was more of an aggressive sign. In other words, the letters were more bulbous, thicker than other signs that I've made. There wasn't a lot of, intricate details, so I ended up getting away from the Dremel tool and moving into a router, which you'll see in a minute. The bit I'm using here is pretty small. It's either 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch. I don't remember, but it's small enough that when I move it around, it doesn't get caught and it doesn't pull into the area that I don't want routed. So I'd rather go over areas. And what I do is I go down one side of the outline and then back along the other side, and if there's anything in the middle, I get it at that time. But if you go off your marks, then your sign is toast, and recovering from that could be a real nightmare if it's at all recoverable. Going into the area that you don't want to remove is not ideal. It's bad. So you can see that I use a plunge cut, and this was an uneven surface on the sign. So I had to go back lower the bit itself and go back a couple of times to make sure that my areas of the writing of the letters was deep enough, which, you just got to play it by ear and see. Now, if I had a dead flat surface, I wouldn't have to do that at all like I had when I used this router tool for cutting out a section on a maple cutting board where I added resin. I didn't do that here, so this was a different situation. And I like undulating, uneven, raw, organic things. There's just something natural about it. I don't, that all polished, I bought this at Pottery Barn thing isn't my deal. All custom, all handmade, all one of a kind. These are letters that I have written, as you've seen, by hand. So that's the uniqueness and beauty of the signs that I make. They are all individually made and one of a kind. No stencil is being used to mock up anything, and it doesn't look manufactured at all, which is what I don't want to do. I don't want to manufacture things. That just doesn't appeal to me. I've been asked before, can you make a bunch of these and just, sell them for less? I'm not a manufacturer. I'm an artist, and I do not want to manufacture things, so that's why they're all done one at a time, all by hand. That doesn't mean I'm not using power tools. So you can see right there the M, even though I haven't dropped down the bit, is a little shallow. So I have to go back and make deeper gouges on those, where right here I'm doing it and it's deep enough. So, it really is you just got to pay attention to it when you're making these cuts, so you have plenty of depth to add your paint later on. And if you don't want to, let's say you want to add resin in there, that's kind of a cool idea, but you got to have some depth there or the resin won't even stick. Now what I'm doing is I'm just going back and trying to clean up these edges and just make them look a little bit nicer, a little smoother. And there's a number of tools that I use with the Dremel to do that. Here are two more tools. They're in a cone shape and they allow you to get the edges so I don't have to go in and sand by hand each one of those edges. They are different coarses, so I picked, I think, the coarsest one because it was a tad aggressive trying to get the all the feathery stuff off the edges of my router bit cuts. Some people have CNC machines that do all of this, and it's all run through a computer, but it's nothing really handmade about it. So, that's the rub. And of course, this takes a lot longer to do, and it's more tedious, but it's definitely one of a kind and handmade, unlike a computer program generating something that a machine produces. So once I had everything dug out, routed out, you can still see I got to do the names of the people who bought it. But once I get that done, I just sand off all those markings that I had from the Sharpie marker and check it out, see how it looks, and, step by step, this process gets done. Now I'm switching my bits, so it's a thinner bit. It's actually a triangular bit that digs down into a point and flares out at the top. And these letters were meant to be smaller, so I wanted to use a smaller bit to do that. So you can't really see it too well, but it's actually like a sharp point going into the wood itself. It goes in at angles. And as much as you want the tools to do everything, it just doesn't always work that way, so I finish off so it's real nice to receive the paint that's next. Actually, the paint isn't next, the urethane is next, but before I do that, I'm just making sure that these edges are nice and smooth so I don't get any of that feathery stuff. And as for the back, since I know it will be covered, I didn't take a lot of time sanding it. It just was extra work that I didn't need to do, and I'm just pulling out little fine hairs from those chip brushes. So after a couple of coats of polyurethane, sanding in between each coat, I also do the back, but the front is obviously way more important than the bark to make it stable because it'll be outside. I start to paint with the black paint, and I try to get fully inside the letters, including up on the edges of the depth of that letter cut. And then I'll come back and sand off whatever spills onto the top. That's why I put a urethane coat on first, so it doesn't seep into the raw wood. So now what I decided to do was fill that crack because I didn't want that to split sometime down the road. So I just took a really thick CA glue and poured it in that crack, and then I'd spray it with an accelerator, and then I'd pour more and spray with an accelerator, and I kept doing that until I felt as though it was filled, and it was also very secure at that point, and it wasn't going to split on them. So the next day, in fact, this probably took me a week or so to make because I had to wait for everything to dry and then go on to the next stages. So a week later, or actually a day later, maybe 2 days later, I sanded off all of these edges to make sure that they were nice. Then once I was done with the sanding, I felt comfortable with it. I blew it off with my air compressor gun and took a closer look, and then I did some final sanding and just scraping off anything that I thought shouldn't be there on the edges. So that happened next. So my making these signs, it's time consuming, but I want to pay attention to details, and I'm making things that are one of a kind and all handmade is really, again, I'm stressing that point, is what this is all about. Not just for me, but for the buyers. Now I come back with the urethane again, and I fill all of the letters so I'm going over the black paint, and go over the entire piece again with the urethane, a couple of coats of that, and just make sure that it's very well saturated. This is going to be outside, so it really needs to be protected well. So you can see that it darkens the wood itself, but it gives it that amber look, and some people don't like it. I like it. I like the contrast too between the letters and the urethane. So after I get a couple coats of urethane on there, sanding in between each coat, I sand one final time and put something that I use on a lot of my items, and it's called Feed and Wax, and I'll put a link to that below. It's great stuff. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you stay tuned, and I'll see you next week. I post a video once a week, and all fine crafts, all made by hand. Thanks for watching.